figure something out. I mean, the
I
last time.
forgot to tell you, but I thought maybe you'd remember. Anyway, just play another
I'll see.
interlude, I suppose.
All right. Speaking of anthems and things like that, I want to ask you if you recognize this. Hold on a second.
Are you on?
Yeah, I'm asking.
I'm not on.
No, I'm on it. Do you remember this?
Lord, create in me a clean heart.
Anyway, I figured you'd recognize that.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a reason for why I played that. You'll figure it out later on.
Okay.
Today, by the way, we're going to be in 2 Samuel 12 and Psalms 51. So you might want to put your finger or a bookmark in one of those.
Psalms what?
Psalms 51.
I'm turned right to it.
Hey, how about that? And but we'll be beginning in 2 Samuel 12. All right. Does anybody know who John Newton was?
Yes.
Tell me.
He wrote the Baptist theme song.
He did.
He wrote Amazing Grace.
Yes. His mother died when he was 6. He joined his father at sea when he was 11, and he rose through the ranks to be a slave ship captain. And he was associated with all of the things that slave ship captains have: profanity, cruelty, the whole 9 yards. Then one night, or one day, I'm not really sure which, there was a bad storm that hit his ship at sea, and he thought he was going to die. It's one of those moments, where in the foxholes there aren't any atheists. And so he had a conversion experience that night. Fell back on all of the teachings that his mother had given him as a child, and started treating his crew and even the slaves better. And then he finally gave that whole thing up because it was contrary to his faith. And then he became a pastor and wrote that song.
Yep.
The Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key when he observed the dawn breaking over an American fort that had been bombarded the night before, and the flag was still waving above it. And this is during the War of 1812, which America really got the short end of that stick. That's the part we should never have done that. His Eyes on the Sparrow was written by Sevilla Martin after an encounter with a woman of faith named Mrs. Doolittle. She was on a vacation in a little cabin, and Mrs. Doolittle was bedridden and had been so for decades. And not only that, but her husband was crippled and couldn't get up and about. But she had a smile on her face every single time that Ms. Martin went over to see her. She always had a smile on her face. It was always a cheerful attitude. And Ms. Martin asked her, she said, "How in the world can you possibly be so happy when you've had so much, bad stuff happen in your life? How is this possible?" And she looked up at her. I just looked up at her with a sparkle in her eyes and said, "His eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me," which eventually became the chorus of that song. And it so impressed that lady. She went back and wrote that song, and we sing it today. You and I sing it many times. All hymns and songs are like that. There's very few, and I can't think of one, Pastor, where they wrote it just because they felt like writing a song. There's usually something that inspired those verses. So when we sing them, I don't think a lot of us sort of look in depth in it. I mean, so many times we only know the first and the last verse of any song, and even the Star-Spangled Banner, we only halfway know that one. But in God We Trust is in the Star-Spangled Banner. If you get down to the last set of verses, we never sing those. But each one of those is inspired by an event. Sometimes a mere second of existence, an epiphany, it's in, and all of a sudden they feel like they have to write that. And that one moment in that person's life produces something that can give hope, patriotism, understanding, wisdom to countless millions of people. How many people, Pastor, do you know of that Amazing Grace is the one definite hymn that everybody knows? Everybody knows that. Created Me a Clean Heart. All right, this song that I just played before, I asked her to look it up online on the way here. How many different varieties did you see?
On one page was like 30.
30 different ones, and they're not all like that one. A lot of them are hip, modern praise band sort of things. The same words, nothing's been changed, nothing's been added. Everything, created me a clean heart. The same words that we sang in a choral event. You get someone up on stage in blue jeans and can sing it up on stage. It has the same effect. The words have not changed.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
There's a Catholic mass that comes on at 6 o'clock in the morning, I think. And this morning I didn't get to change the channel quick enough, but they have two men standing at a microphone, kicking guitars, and they are singing praise and worship songs before the
In the
mass
Catholic
begins.
church?
In the Catholic church.
Oh, yeah, they've been doing that for years.
And
Yeah.
it was
Well, yeah,
just
the Jews do
amazing
that.
to me.
The Jews do that too.
Yeah, well, if they're trying to appeal to a different audience. You know, I mean, the words, this is what I'm trying to get at. The words in the song don't have different meanings, or it's the same meaning, but a different medium. And if you know, we heard one this morning, it was definitely something that would have been sung at New Spring. You know, just you know, but it's not the same 7 lines over and over again. It was the same words that we sang in the choral thing, but someone is going to be receptive to that one. Someone's going to be receptive to ours. There was one that was a quartet of women that sang it.
Yeah.
Right? Beautiful, but the same words, no deviation, no. It was the same word.
Probably a barbershop arrangement of it.
I'm sure there is.
And those, one more thing, no, shut up. In some of those songs, you have to be careful because they never mention God, they never mention Jesus, but it's all left out. And that was the problem and I still have. It could be like any song that I would sing to him or to you. You know, it's like a love song, but you don't know who you're singing it to.
I agree with that.
So, yeah.
But
That's why there's been so many Christian songs that are the new, you know, and the new thing that has crossed over to the
Popular stuff.
popular songs.
Yeah.
Now, I can go through my own poems, because everybody in here knows I write poems, and I can go through my own poems and tell you what I was going through at that particular moment that I wrote those, because I am back in that moment. Very seldom do I ever just like, I really need to write a poem and write something down. There's usually something that inspired it. Singing the songs is one thing, but I feel if we put the songs into the context of what created them, it gives a whole new depth to both things. The song itself, but also the author, you know, what they were going through. I mean, so, you know, like I said, Amazing Grace, you knew the story and everything. It gives you a deeper respect for that song. It's not just something that you sing. Someone was going through that emotionally and suffering in that situation. You know, it saved a wretch like me. And he did. I mean, he had a horrible life leading up to it. It really meant something to him. And so that's the point of why I'm trying to bring this up. I'm bringing this up today because we have a unique opportunity to enhance our lesson today. Remember how I told you David was a songwriter. He was the one that was playing that lyre for Saul when he was dodging spears. He wrote many of the psalms in the book of Psalms.
Yes.
And there's one particular psalm, and I'm sure you know now which one it is, Psalms 51, during his lowest moment of today's lesson. So while he's going through what he's going through here, we know the story, but now we can also get his take on it. So it's not sort of like, and David thought this and David thought that. We actually have the poem to where he took that and created me a clean heart is in that song. So we can learn about not just what happened, but how he actually felt at the time. Now, to recap what happened last lesson, David broke half of the 10 Commandments in quick succession. Wanting Bathsheba, pursuing her, impregnating her, killing her husband by executive order, and marrying her, and she bore him a son. That final verse in the last lesson is the one that really got to me. It says, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Dun, 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 because you know it's not going to end that way. You see, David thought he had gotten away with it. I mean, nobody really knew what had happened except for him and Bathsheba, he thought. And to be honest, no person really did. But God knew. And, as it said in that last verse, he was displeased by what David had done. And if there's one thing I've learned about God, is that God is going to let you know if you've pleased him, and he's going to let you know if you've displeased him. It's just a matter of how he expresses such displeasure. So today's lesson takes place 1 year after that child was born. right? So David's definitely gotten away with it now. I mean, a whole year has transpired since the moment that baby was born. Nobody's come up to him. Nobody's attacked him. Nobody's brought it up. Everybody's been quiet about it. He's bullet dodged. He's got away with it. Now, one of the duties of being, there are a lot of things that kings had to do back in those days. You know, leading the military. And David was leading the religious sectors too. I mean, he was the one that would go to the tabernacle and pray and all that stuff. Or not tabernacle, but to the, you'd go and pray on the benefit of the people. But they were judges. The king would have the people bring in, they'd present their civil cases to, well, he stole this, he stole this, he got this, he killed this guy, whatever. And so he'd look up in the book and say, all right, well, the penalty for that is so-and-so, so be it. Solomon, later on, one of the famous cases that we always remember about him is the two women that came to him and said, this is my baby. And she said, no, she stole that baby, that's mine. And she said, no, it's mine. So he said, look, let's just cut the baby right down the middle. You have half and she have half. And
they said, okay.
And the one they said, yeah, that's fine with me. And then the other one said, no, she can have it. She can have it, that's fine. And then he knew that was the real mother because she wanted the child to live regardless, even if it wasn't in her care. So anyway, the point is that is a common thing. Remember, Moses had to do this all the time. In fact, he got so weighed down with having to judge all these little squabbles between these people that God finally said, look, you need to delegate. You're going to have to hire some assistants to deal with these cases because you've got to lead my people and do all this stuff. You got other things to do. But back in King David's time, the cases are brought before David. Probably had some sort of mediation process outside.
Supreme Court.
Yeah, probably. But his is the final and lasting decision. And so King David is on his throne, and the prophet Nathan shows up in his court. 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 4.
The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it and grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him.
Now, this is probably a fairly common case. Theft. Bring that before the king. He's going to make his deliberation and judgment right there. The analogy is obvious when we look at it here because this is right on the heels of the Bathsheba story. We can see, what this is, but remember, this is a year removed, so David's not even thinking about that. Yeah. David won't see the connection. He's just going to see this as any other trial that's brought before him. And this is a sad story of a man who had been given a lot. He was beyond blessed with stuff and riches. I mean, remember, the wealth was determined by how much cattle and sheep and all that stuff that you owned. On the other side, you've got a man who doesn't have anything except for one little lamb. Reminds me of Princess, ate from his table, slept in his bed. The love showered on this lamb by the poor man is extraordinary. It was like a family member. Which, I never understood. Mom, you were raised up on a farm. Did you get attached? I mean, Charlotte's Web, they get attached to the pig and don't want to kill it, and whatnot. Did you have to deal with that on the farm? Did you ever have any emotional attachment to any pasture? You cold-blooded individual. Now, another thing.
If you give names to the animals, that's when you got the problem.
Oh.
If you name them.
All right.
If you don't name them, it's just food on the table.
I guess. But Charlotte's Web, once again, that was the whole thing. What are you saving this pig about?
Survival.
Yeah, that's true.
Him or us.
Nobody ate pigtails. Nobody else thinks pigtails. Chicken feet.
The rich man being hospitality driven as he was. Now remember, back in those days, people judged you and your status by how hospitable you were. We've discussed this at length.
And your status was based on how much cattle.
Your wealth was based on how much stuff you had, but your status was based on how hospitable you were. You could be a rich man, but they say he's a cruel, vicious person if he wasn't hospitable to visitors came up to him, okay? And so this man who has a visitor come in and visit him, has to show off his hospitality. But instead of using his own sheep, which he has plenty of, he decides to steal the one thing that this other guy has got from him. And this is a civil suit. There are rules in Exodus on how to deal with this sort of theft. In Exodus 22:1, it says, quote, "Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep." So the answer is obvious. The rich man's got to pay it back fourfold. That's what it says in Exodus. That's the rules that David's going to be using. And so let's hear his judgment, 5 and 6.
David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that man 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity."
So David burns with anger. How dare anybody in his kingdom
Yeah.
be so cruel and without pity? That he uses that term, without pity.
Yeah.
Pastor, is that what yours says?
What's that?
Is that what yours says? That, how can you do this when he had no pity?
What verse is that?
That's the end of verse 6.
End of verse 6. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity.
No pity, no pity. All right. At first, what's the penalty that he suggests for the rich man?
Die.
He's got to be killed. But then he shifts to the legal statute of this fourfold thing, which we talked
Before
about
he
next
dies.
But David is angry. How could somebody be so remorseless and show no pity? Now, remember the characteristic that David shares with God. What was the one thing that it said? It said, "I'm going to pick a person after my own heart." Remember, that's what God says. David is experiencing the same pain and anger that God felt at David. How could someone be so cruel and remorseless?
Yeah.
Exactly what he's saying about this rich man who doesn't exist. That's what God was feeling, because he shares the same heart. That's what he was feeling at what David had done. And didn't have any pity about it, didn't have any remorse. I mean, she mourned, and then he married her, but I mean, didn't say anything that he felt bad about it. This burning anger is a human analogy to what God felt towards David.
But like you said in the past, because of what we know about the lineage of David beyond this point, she had to marry him.
Yeah, I'm going to get to
And
that.
probably he would have died in battle anyway.
Anyway, yeah, David,
God had a plan, but he stepped forward and went ahead of God, and that's where he got in trouble.
and probably a year later. I mean, think about it. Solomon is born after this episode.
Yeah.
And so this whole year between the birth of the child and what's happening today, that probably would have been the dating period of David and Bathsheba. Uriah may have died. And he may have died. And then he would have noticed her mourning and comforted her and done the right thing and taken her as a wife. It would have been a beautiful story.
Nathan would have praised him for it.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, God would have praised for it. But see, once again, that would have pleased God. This displeased God. Him jumping the gun and trying to get ahead.
There you go.
And so, but what I found interesting here is that God gives the gift, if you want to call it that, to David of the same feeling that he had. Remember, when he was talking to God all the time, he was flipping coins and getting answers. But he also had Jonathan come and talk to him to express, the emotions, the feeling behind it. Now, God is using Nathan to stir in David the same anger that he had generated in God a year earlier. How could David do such a thing without pity? And so, Mom, 7 through 12.
Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing that what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Amorites. Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel.
You are the man. Imagine
Thou
how
art
fast.
the man.
Imagine how fast that burning anger was extinguished in David. I mean, I'll turn on a dime. I mean, that guy's got.
Oh, that's me.
Let's go back to that fourfold thing again.
Yeah.
God goes through all the list of all the ways that God has provided for David. You know, this is gratitude for you. I've done all this stuff, and the line I love in that, if that had been too little, I would have given you even more. And God does do that, even today. I used the word beyond blessed when I was talking to her. I wrote a poem titled Beyond Blessed, where I'm giving thanks to God for all the stuff that He's done for us. Yet you did evil in my eyes and took the wife of Uriah and killed him. The analogy of the lamb would have been more enraging, wouldn't it, if the rich man not only had taken the lamb but killed the man? Think about that. He didn't even go into that part of the story. He just said he took the lamb. Think of the anger that would have burned up inside David if he had said, not only did he steal the one lamb, but he killed the man on his way out the door. That would have...
Wonder why he didn't. That seems to be the bigger sin.
I know. And I'm with you on that.
But God doesn't measure sin by
By gradations.
the size of it.
No. There are no shades of sin. And the analogy, let's see here, but how can you pay fourfold to a dead man? Because now David by law, he has to pay fourfold, and that's what he's going to be doing. God's penalties are fourfold in nature. If you look at them, and we're going to go through each one of these penalties, there are 4 punishments in here. So God is making David pay fourfold for the sin of murdering Uriah.
So how does he do that?
All right, well, number 1, he said, you use the sword, the sword's never going to leave your house. And Amnon is coming up next week, his 2 sons. And so you can see that God keeps his promises. Calamity in your house. Because you destroyed Uriah's house, your house is going to be in disarray.
That's the 4.
That's the second one. You committed adultery, your wives are going to cheat on you. And you try to keep it secret, but I'm going to embarrass you publicly. Those are the 4. Those are the 4. Fourfold punishment. So God is living by that Exodus 22 rule. He is going to pay fourfold for what he did.
Yeah.
So let's see how David reacts to this. Pastor, 13 through 17.
Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die. And after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and went into his house and spent the night lying on the ground. The elders of the household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused. And he would not eat any food with them.
All right, so the first thing David does is what? This is very, very important. What's the first thing he does after Nathan's finished saying?
He confessed.
He admits his guilt. He confesses his sin. All right. Now remember, this is the same pattern that we've got to go through. All right. So what happens when you confess your sin? What does God do at that point?
He forgives you.
He forgives you, and God does. Right here it says, notice how God forgives him as soon as he admits it. All right.
Yep.
It was an unforgiven sin that whole year. But now that he's been confronted, David admits his guilt, his sin, and God forgives right away. The Lord has taken away your sin. Just wash it away, white as snow. But
ain't the end of this.
But the boy is going to die because David has shown contempt for the Lord. Now, this is the part of the story that gets the atheists all riled up. They're like, well, why should this child, this innocent child, have to suffer and be killed for David's sin? The sins of the father should not be passed on to the child. And it's the same sort of anti-abortion argument that we use. You know, the child is innocent because you cheated and did whatever that you weren't supposed to do. There's no reason to punish or kill the child for this. So this is always a verse that always gets twisted up. Why is it that David is going to live, but this child has to go? What loving God could do such a thing? Why is, well, here's a couple of reasons. All right, God still has a lot of stuff for David to do. Number one, and David wouldn't learn from this had he been killed. David.
What would he have done?
Yeah. David's pleading and heartfelt remorse is preserved for us to learn from to this day. So, if he had struck David down for his sin right away, we would not have Psalm 51. We would not have created me a clean heart. We wouldn't have any of that stuff. So the benefit, how many countless millions of people have heard that song or read this text or know at least about created me a clean heart, oh God, which we're going to be reading in a minute. How many countless millions of people have been moved and turned to God based on David's suffering at this exact moment?
And God knew that, so that's why His Spirit did.
And it's preserved for us to this day, immortalized in Psalm 51. So I'm going to read this. If you look at Psalm 51, it says at the very beginning, it says, "For the director of music, a psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba." So there's no question about when this was written or what he was going through. All right. So let's put this in context now. He's admitted his sin. He's been caught. He knows that God keeps his punishments and his promises. But he's still going to be fasting and pleading with God for these 7 days. All right. So this was written during those 7 days. Here it is. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." And we know what the sin is, because we now know the story behind it. This is not just a catch-all for any kind of sin.
Yeah.
This is a very specific one. "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. You are right in your verdict, and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me, yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom, even in that secret place." Now here's my favorite line of this one, aside from the typical. "Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow." And you know how I have an affinity for hyssop. Hyssop was the stalk that was used to give Jesus his vinegar on the cross. So David here is asking to be cleansed with hyssop, which is a soap. It's a plant that's used to make soap. He's asking for that cleansing power of hyssop to be used on him, but hyssop was there when Jesus' cleansing power was used on me.
There's another song coming up. It's next line.
"Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice." What?
"Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow."
Yes.
Whiter than snow.
Yeah, that's another one. Once again, a multitude of songs that we all know in here. "Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." It sort of loses something in the translation rather than King James. "Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me." Now, that line is very, very key, and that is because who has he personally seen God take his Holy Spirit away from? Saul. He sees and he knows what happens when you take and he also knows the story of Samson, where all of a sudden the Spirit of the Lord had left him. So he knows how dangerous and perilous that is. He does not want to lose that. "Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me." And this is another piece. And this right here is the embodiment of Psalm 51. Because right here, "Then will I teach transgressors your ways, so that sinners will turn back to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, you who are God, my Savior, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness." So we are learning right now the penalties of sin and how forgiving God is in this psalm itself. "Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. May it please you to prosper Zion, to build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of the righteous, in burnt offerings offered whole. Then bulls will be offered to your altar." So not only is he praying for himself and his sins, but he's praying for his whole nation, as a leader should. But then so while he's in the suffering, lying in sackcloth on the floor, this is what he's writing. Powerful, powerful. There have been multiple songs and hymns based on this one song. this request to be cleansed of sin, the request for restoration, the promise to tell others about how God operates, and the suffering that sin causes, all are right here. This is why the child was stricken, among other reasons. Look at what David created for us in his moment of sadness and inspiration. But the child does die. Dad, can you read 18 through 20, 2 Samuel 12 again?
Let's see, where are we, 16 through 20?
No, 18 through 20.
18 through 20. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. Through what?
20.
David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. And 20?
20, yes, sir.
Then David got up from the ground after he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went to the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate.
So, the death of the prince is a bit of bad news that nobody wanted to tell David. I mean, the old adage is you kill the messenger, right?
Yeah.
You don't like the news. I'm sure that was in the back of their minds. And, Saul probably would have thrown a spear or two.
Yeah.
This is what they were exposed to. And while they were whispering about it, being concerned about it, David noticed, and he knows. He's asking for verification, but he figures that, God does keep his promises. I mean, he knows. But look at how he does react when he finds out the child is dead. He gets up, takes a bath, lotions himself up, puts on a fresh set of clothes, goes, worships, and then eats. Now, very odd behavior if you think about it. I mean, this guy, they asked him to eat. They begged him to eat for those 7 days, and he refused. He wouldn't do it. And now, all of a sudden, at his request, he asked them to bring him food so he can eat. Now, there are so many other things that could go through people's minds. And now remember, the reason why God was displeased by what David had done is because David had taken care of things the way the world would have done it, not the way he would have done it. So David, once again, is going to be acting differently. So normally you'd yell, you'd scream, throw a tirade, kill one or two of the servants bringing you stuff. That would have been expected and perfectly understood by the people around him. He's in not in his right frame of mind. We know what. How would you feel if that happened to you? And you know what I'm saying? Then not only that, but he taking a bath, clean up, puts on his clothes. I mean, you think there's any time that you'd be mourning and debasing yourself, it'd be after the child is dead, not when not before. And
But he knew it was going to happen because God said it would happen. So it wasn't unexpected for him. He knew the final outcome, and he was prepared for it.
But his attendants notice that he's behaving sort of odd, so they ask him about it. Mom, 21 through 23.
His servants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat." He answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me."
This is something that I think even most Christians don't understand. Forgiveness of sin. Does that absolve you of the penalty for said crime or sin? It does not. And a lot of people think that being saved absolves you of all penalties. And it doesn't. Now, so I love this line. It says, who knows? Maybe God may be gracious to me and let the child live. There was still hope that, maybe, God would see how much he was suffering and all that stuff. But once again, he was not going to learn the lesson had the child lived. And not only that, but the surrounding nations would have said, this is rewarding bad behavior. David commits adultery and murder, and, God lets him have, the neighboring ones would have lost respect for God too. There's no penalty involved.
That again is worldly stuff.
Yes, definitely. And once again, totally alien from what God wants for us.
Right.
And to hit that home, one of the radio show hosts I listen to, Todd Schnitt, is Jewish, but not a practicing Jew. and he just doesn't get concepts. And it was rubbed in my face this past week, when the Charleston shooter down at the AME, one of the daughters of one of the victims said publicly that she forgave Dylan, and Todd Schnitt was yelling on his microphone, "How in the world can you forgive this monster? How can you? That doesn't make any sense to me." Well, you know why it doesn't make any sense to him. He's got a messed up, screwed up concept of forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean that you are free from any of the consequences of your behavior. You still are going to go to jail or get executed or whatever. Forgiveness is for the person giving the forgiveness. Now, I'm not going to let your poison consume me. And he doesn't get that. Another thing that I heard this past week was he was talking about, there's a guy that called in, sounds very much like any one of us talking. Turns out the guy was 91 years of age. And Todd said, you sound great for 91. And he said, well, I've had a couple of bad years lately, and I've lived a great life, and I'm ready to go home. Todd was depressed by that. He said, that makes me feel sad that some guy wants to die. He doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. He has no concept. And it bothers me that a lot of, definitely the people that are outside that are secularists, the way of the world doesn't understand that concept at all. They don't understand forgiveness. They don't understand eternity. And they don't understand wanting to go to heaven. They have no clue about any of that stuff. And the problem is, I think a lot of that is seeped inside our Christianity too. A lot of us don't understand what forgiveness means. The concept is, if I forgive you, then I won't remember what you did to me anymore. Well, that's setting yourself up to be a doormat, because they're going to do the same thing over and over and over again.
I think what she said later on maybe was that you have to forgive in order to be forgiven.
So she's looking even beyond just Dylan.
Exactly.
That's what God says. If Jesus could forgive the people who put him on the cross and killed him, why can't you forgive your neighbor for transgressing over something?
But then the question becomes, well, then I've got a free pass then. I did you wrong, and you're not going to hold it against me, and then I can do it again, see? And that's not exactly what, and once again, I think people try to twist forgiveness all up. Forgiveness is not legal. If I go up on the stand and say, I forgive, people for stealing stuff from us or whatever, that doesn't mean that the judge is going to say, well, then you don't want any of theirs. You don't want restitution. That's not the way it works. But so God forgave David, but the penalty still was in place. I like how David explains his, when he said, I will go to the child. Is that David looking at, two ways you can look at that. Is that talking about David going in and doing the corpse? Or is he thinking beyond that and thinking
God.
eternity? I will go to him, but he won't come to me. What do you think, Pastor? Is that?
Think about eternity.
Yeah, I think David was thinking, because he'd been in that prayerful mode, and when you get that, you understand a little bit more. When you put forth the effort to put it down into writing, you have a lot of self-reflection and understanding of how God has blessed you and what you have. And so I think he thought about that. And so, the child was gone, but he was going to see that child someday. I think that's what he was saying.
My mother lost 3 children, had 3 children that died. 2 little girls, 17, 18 months old, and a little boy when I was next to, he was 6. When my mother died, she had the most beautiful expression on her face that I have ever seen. And those of us close to her believe that she saw a glimpse of heaven, and maybe those were babies.
I'm sure.
I'll never forget it as long as I live.
I mean, you keep telling us every time when we talk about heaven, you say, I look forward to seeing, my relatives. I look forward to seeing my sister that I never saw, or your brother.
Brother that I barely remember. He was 6 and I was about 4 when he died. I look forward to seeing that. I want to renew the family relationship, mother and daddy, other brother and sister.
And that gift of that God gives us, that sort of peace. I mean, you think about it, in your life, you would be perfectly right, the worldview, to be grumpy and bitter about the calamity that happened in your family when you were early. I mean, yes, you survived, but I mean, you were stricken with polio, and you lost all these siblings, and how could you possibly be happy? Same sort of thing. His eye is on the sparrow. I know he watches me. Same thing here.
I look forward to that great day.
So I like how David explains his fasting. back in verse 16. If you go back and look, what does it say in verse 16?
He pleaded with
Yes.
God for the child.
Yes, I'm pleading for the life of the child. I'm fasting and pleading for the life of the child. That is removed, so therefore the fasting and the pleading is superfluous. There's no reason for it. He thought, who knows, maybe God will be gracious and let me keep my son. So he was trying to lower himself, beg for forgiveness. Maybe God would wash the punishment away. But as I said, forgiveness and punishment, two totally different things. See, who was the last one to read? That was Dad. Mom, 24 and 25.
Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and lay with her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah.
Now, as you have brought up before, I never heard of King Jedediah. I've never heard of that. King Solomon, maybe that was his middle name, who knows. But this is an interesting point that I feel needs to be addressed, and you already touched on it, Dad. It's my contention that Bathsheba was going to be David's wife eventually anyway. I mean, think about all the stuff that's going to be happening under Saul's guidance, all right? Now, that also is going to be setting up for the persecution.
Is it Saul's guidance?
No, Solomon's. If I said Solomon, it's Solomon's. All of the stuff that's going to follow, the exile, the return, the Jesus. You realize that Solomon's lineage leads to
And without
Joseph.
Solomon, there'd be no Colosseum in Rome.
You could look at it that way too. But anyway, what I'm pointing out here is through Solomon's lineage, eventually Joseph is going to be betrothed to Mary 1,000 years from this incident. And Mary, by the way, is going to be David's son Nathan is going to be her ancestor. But Solomon is too pivotal a person in God's plan to have been an accident. I contend. Now I can also contend that God can make anything happen. But I believe that Uriah would have been killed in the campaign anyway, and that David would have been introduced to the mourning widow of Bathsheba, and Solomon would have been born after they were married anyway. David jumped the gun. Had he waited for God's plan to unfold, Bathsheba would have been his without all the suffering and guilt that he's gone through. Of course, we'd also be without Psalms 51.
Sure.
There's two incidences in the Bible that, this incident and then also Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah, Ishmael and Isaac.
Yeah,
When you
you
get
jump
ahead
ahead.
of God, God's going to give you a promise, and humans, impatient humans that we are, we jump the gun and we create. Look at all the strife that decision is created.
It's still to this day.
Yes. Jedediah means beloved of the Lord, and Mary, like I said. Solomon's line leads to Joseph. Mary is through Nathan's line. And speaking of David's kids, we just talked about two of them, Solomon and Nathan. Remember that promise of God's that David's house is going to have calamity and a whole bunch of bloodshed in it? Next week, the calamity begins.
Good story. Good lesson.
Good, huh?
Thank you.